Hello, class. Today we're going to discuss Madavo's article, Lessons from the Rainmaker's Perspective. At the outset, I just want to mention Madavo is clearly not a native English speaker, and his paper was not proofed by one. So there's some errors in the language that can be distracting, but I hope you can look past that to the substance of the paper, which I think has some valuable insights that hopefully will come out in the lecture today. So to start, we should ask, what can we learn about environmental ethics by approaching it from a traditional African perspective? And one thing that we'll have to overcome in trying to answer that question is intuitions grounded either in the experience of Western European nations that colonized Africa in the 20th century, or in the experience of being colonized that is shared by the people of Africa. The reason we want to do this is that we're looking for, again, insights from the traditional perspective to see what sort of new voice that can bring to the environmental ethics project. Now, not all African environmental ethics needs to deny or disregard, in particular, the insights that arise from suffering colonization. That's certainly a valid voice to listen to and also has its own insights to share. But the purpose of this paper is to look beyond that and, as best we can, try to examine the perspective of a traditional African environmental ethics, because we're looking specifically for insights that may be unfamiliar to the Western environmental ethics tradition. That I think is something that the reading today brings out pretty well. So one way of thinking of what we're after is that it would be nice if we could have a sort of pre-colonial perspective and get back to this strictly traditional outlook. But that is, strictly speaking, impossible. We have really lost that perspective and any access to a pre-colonial perspective. So, as is often, this is often described, what we seek is a post-colonial perspective. So, a sort of return to as close to this pre-colonial perspective as we can get, but one that is informed by the kind of lessons that we can take from the experience of those who have been colonized, and we are not past that, but moving past that. So we're seeking what we call a post-colonial perspective. And the way that Madavo is going to approach this issue of getting a post-colonial perspective is grounded in traditional African perspectives, is to look at the Rainmaker tradition in African societies. So, of course, there are many distinct forms of this, but we can look at certain commonalities. And one that Madavo really wants to focus on is that Rainmakers were highly regarded members of their communities and were considered to be in touch with nature in a special way. And furthermore, because of that special communion with nature, they served as role models of human environmental interactions. And that gives them, in the tradition, a unique insight into how humans should interact with the broader natural world. And then we should note that Rainmakers were the primary advisors to kings and chieftains regarding a number of issues, but above all, the use of water, which of course is a crucial life-sustaining resource And certainly in many parts of Africa, it's a very, very scarce resource. So at the time when, or times when the Rainmaker tradition was really flourishing, times of plenty with respect to water were considered both a cause and a consequence of the well-being of the political or tribal community. And times of drought were both a cause and consequence of a badly functioning polity. So it's easy from a contemporary or modernist perspective to understand how times of plenty would be a cause of well-being, or times of drought a cause of bad functioning. But it's important to understand that this was considered a sort of feedback loop, where times of plenty were also a consequence of the community doing well. And I think there's a double meaning to doing well here. That's on the one hand flourishing, and the other hand also acting as they should. So there's some magical thinking going on here, which we should acknowledge that these are not plausible causal claims, but that's really not the important point, right? It doesn't matter from what we're trying to get out of examining the Rainmaker tradition that it's not really plausible to understand the behavior of the tribal community as having a sort of magical causal effect on what the weather is going to do, because we're not talking about something like human caused change in the weather, the way we think of global warming, but rather of the world responding to the actions of humans in something like an intelligent or guided fashion. So what we have here is a view of, again, a feedback loop between the social behaviors of the tribe as a whole and the tribal members, and how we could say the earth or nature treats that tribe. So the Rainmaker's views as this special category of people inside the community was both a sort of religious or philosophical outlook and a political one, because of this primary advisor role. So what's the content of the Rainmaker's ethical viewpoint? Well, as we've seen earlier in the semester, it's largely been agreed that African environmental ethics is anthropocentric. It's grounded in the well-being of humans. Now, this is not necessarily it's not an individualist anthropocentric view, because it doesn't just latch onto the individual in isolation of others. It's more holistic than that. But the standard understanding of traditional African environmental ethics is that it is focused either exclusively or in a fundamentally particular way on humans, on the anthropocentric. And if that's true, then it can only recognize indirect duties to non-human animals. So I could have an obligation to you not to harm some non-human animal, possibly because harming this or that animal would anger the earth or anger spirits, and they would bring harm and destruction on us, and that's something I shouldn't do to you. But on this indirect duties view, I can't have an obligation directly to that animal. So this anthropocentrism also rules out the possibility of direct duties to non-animals of all kinds, right? If it's not possible to have a commitment to a cow or a goat, it's not strictly speaking impossible, but it's going to be highly unlikely that such a view is going to say that we do have direct duties to plants or mountains or anything like that. Madavo wants to challenge this understanding. He actually thinks that if we look at the Rainmaker tradition, we see an African environmental ethics that is not anthropocentric. And so he wants to bring that out by looking at 4 key concepts from the Rainmaker tradition. The first we're going to discuss is the idea of evil in the land. So this is the idea of the environment responding in something like an intelligent way, a morally loaded way to the behaviors of individual humans and the given human community as a whole. So as we said earlier, the Rainmaker tradition includes the idea that the presence or absence of water, particularly rain, is an indication of the moral and spiritual quality of the social unit. So part of maintaining a positive moral and spiritual quality requires treating creatures other than humans, and this is going to extend to other animals, plants, and inanimate objects like mountains, forests, and lakes in the proper way. And then again, this is going to have this causal loop where the treatment essentially of human individuals and the community is, again, both cause and consequence of how nature as a whole, and in particular rain patterns, are going to treat the community. Now, some of this response to the moral and spiritual quality of the community is grounded on this view in the idea that we need to maintain environmental quality for ancestor spirits. So Madavo talks about the idea that the tribe's spiritual ancestors need to drink water from sacred ponds. And so you have an obligation among the living humans to maintain that pond so that the ancestor spirits also have access to clean, unpolluted water. And if you don't do that, you could have negative consequences affecting the living that are coming through their treatment of not living human beings. So we could say that that's still anthropocentric. So, but that's only some of this relation between living humans and the broader world. It's not the whole picture. And if you move beyond just a focus on ancestor spirits, then you will see that there's no suggestion in the tradition that the ways you, morally speaking, must treat non-human things in order to maintain this positive moral and spiritual quality. There's no reason to think that that all relates back to humans. And if that's right, that suggests a non-anthropocentric view. So the notions used in understanding this positive relation that we've talked about, that manifests in things like more plentiful water, it's holistic. Right? It involves maintaining balance between things and maintaining moral purity. So it is not just focused on this or that individual human or even the collective of individual humans. If it's a matter of balance, then it is going to be looking at the relations between multiple things, and it's going to be valuing the relation itself, not exclusively, but the relation is going to be among the things that has moral or spiritual value and that has an appropriate way for it to be treated. And as Madavo puts it, there was this idea that if you harm this balance between things, the land could become angry. This is pasarat samwa. You don't need to memorize that term, but get the idea of causing anger within nature itself, either some specific part or again, the whole ecosystem, the whole collective. And this seems clearly to be non-anthropocentric, right? So it's both holistic, and because you could have a holism that still only looked at the collective relations among humans. This is not like that. It's holistic and non-anthropocentric, because humans have an important role to play here in maintaining this balance or harmony between all things, but they're not the only things that directly affect that balance. And the harmony of the social group is just one component of the overall harmony that avoids creating this evil in the land, this form of becoming angry or having other sorts of negative, morally loaded responses. Right? So I think that's something that Madavo could have brought out a little better, but I want us to make sure we realize is this is not just a pragmatic notion of, oh, if we do this, nature will do that to us, it'll hurt us. It's more the idea that nature as a whole or some component of it would have the moral standing to punish us, to be angry about something, to have this sort of reactive attitude of, hey, you haven't treated me the way I have a right to expect to be treated. And these negative responses are not just, I'm angry, I'm lashing out, but an idea of justified negative response. So creating or maintaining this balance is a morally loaded notion. It's not just about what's going to be prudentially good or bad for us, but it's about what we ought to do to show the proper sort of respect towards all things. Now, this is, as I said earlier, undeniably magical thinking, right? There's thoughts about ways that humans can affect changes in the patterns of weather, and this is no longer scientifically plausible. So I want to note that you do not need to buy into this metaphysical notion of the land literally becoming angry. You don't need to do that, and you shouldn't do that. It's not sort of scientifically respectable. We know that that's not how environmental changes work, but that's not the important thing. Right? This notion of human actions having these consequences was just part and parcel of a broader ethical conception. And one of the things Madavo wants to really push is that that broader ethical conception is not implausible in the way that thinking, oh, if we don't perform this sacrifice or respect that holy day, it would literally cause a drought. So it's important to see the way we could take the ethical perspective and abstract it from these magical metaphysical notions of how causation works in the world. What we're looking at is, what is the general worldview that emerges from this metaphysical perspective, and we can still adopt that, and maybe we should adopt it, so long as it doesn't have a sort of necessary grounding in that metaphysical picture. And Madavo thinks it doesn't. You can reject the metaphysical picture while seeing the value and rightness in the ethical picture. So with that said, again, this conception is non-anthropocentric. So it looks at things broader than the individual human or the human community. Indeed, it even holds that animals other than humans can cause an imbalance that changes weather patterns. And Madavo thinks that this is important. Now, I want to note that it's not so clear to me what significance this idea of other animals causing a change in or causing an imbalance in this holistic picture that would, in a way that would change weather patterns. It's not clear to me what that has to do with anthropocentrism, because it could be that this just means humans have an obligation to other humans to do something like preventing livestock from drinking from a sacred pond. That would be a picture that does not imply the livestock are moral beings themselves. So I think there is something to this broad ethical notion of preventing evil in the land and not making the land angry, but connecting this up with the idea that other animals have a kind of moral standing to affect this balance, that doesn't seem all that important to me, because we could cash that out in anthropocentric terms. But that's a sort of minor point. We don't need to hang the significance of this idea of evil in the land or the land becoming angry on this proposal of other animals having an ability to morally affect the world. Because what's really important here is the implication of the ecosystem's weather patterns themselves responding to the moral or immoral actions of humans and maybe other animals as well. Because if the weather patterns are responding in a morally loaded fashion to the behaviors of humans and possibly other animals, this suggests that nature itself is a moral agent that can rightfully hold humans responsible for their actions, either by offering or withholding rain. So again, as I was saying, this is not a prudential picture. In some ways, I think this connects up to a very famous paper and became a whole philosophical moral movement in the 20th century in Western philosophical ethical thinking, which was the idea that either just what it is to hold someone morally responsible, or at least a crucial part of holding someone morally responsible, is having these reactive attitudes like resentment. Because when something makes you angry, you could just be lashing out at it or just wanting to cause pain for pain. But when you resent someone and you respond to them on the basis of resentment, there has to be a notion of, I've been mistreated. Not just, oh, something's happened that hurts me, but I've been treated in ways that I should not be treated. So this philosopher, P.F. Strawson, tried to use this to really understand the concepts of freedom of the will, and moral responsibility. And he said, what it is to be morally responsible is for other people to take me as an appropriate target of reactive emotions. So if someone says to me, I resent the fact that you did this or that to me, they are holding me responsible. And here we have the idea that nature itself also has the standing to hold me responsible. That elevates it to being a moral agent itself. And that's definitely moving past this simple prudential, if I do this, that will happen kind of picture. So that was the second of Madavo's points. The third one he makes is not really helpful to his thesis, I don't think. So he points to objections to industrialized power generation in Africa as a basis of the idea for, so these objections were made on the basis of the idea that, for instance, creating a hydroelectric plant would disrupt the lives of mermaids and make their dwellings uninhabitable, using the water to create electrical energy. And his suggestion here is that this was a kind of morally loaded response to the idea of harming something that's not human. I think we would really need to look at the specifics of how, in this case, the Bantu people understood mermaids. If that translation is appropriate and they're thought of the way Europeans thought of mermaids, that would be beings with a human intelligence. And so even though they're not biologically human, they would be, we might say, quote unquote, humans in the moral sense. And then that would fit with an anthropocentric picture. If there's a different understanding of what mermaids are, or would be if they actually existed, then this might be non-anthropocentric, but I don't think we can just count on that. So let's just move on to the fourth topic Madavo brings up, and I think this one is really interesting. So he writes that this is the relation between the Rainmaker tradition and contemporary agriculture. So he writes that agriculture is the highest manifestation of human relations with the environment. It wasn't clear to me if this is his view or if he was reporting the view of the Rainmaker tradition, but let's suppose that it's the latter. In that case, this sounds a lot like the mentorship model of human nature relations that we saw all the way back in Sylvan's article, and we saw him criticize this. So if this is the highest manifestation of human relations with the environment, that sounds like the highest manifestation is humans, quote unquote, perfecting nature by making it more abundant in its production of things that humans can use. And that seems pretty anthropocentric. So we might think, Madavo, you've just brought up a point that actually hurts your thesis that this traditional African perspective is non-anthropocentric. But we should recall the Rainmaker's position of having this advisory authority, and we should understand traditional African agricultural practices as being mediated by the guidance of these individuals who, it was believed, could converse with nature and essentially report back nature's approval or disapproval of a given agricultural project. That would understand the agriculture itself as being sensitive to what is and isn't appropriate as a way of treating the natural world. So as Madavo sees it, the transition during colonialist times to industrial or commercial farming, that represents a departure from this norm of sort of checking in with nature to see if it's okay with something. And when that happens, then there is a truly anthropocentric approach to agriculture and the natural world. But that is not what we get within the Rainmaker tradition. So that does suggest a sort of non-anthropocentrism. When the ethos of the Rainmaker was dominant, then essentially all African agriculture was subsistence farming. And Madavo wants to bring out how this involved very little wasteful production of produce, right? Nobody could ever know exactly how much food needed to be produced to feed the needed number of people. But in general, there was very little food waste produced, unlike in contemporary times where food waste is a huge problem. So in this traditional perspective, wasting food was seen sort of as an insult to the gods, because the gods provided rain and other conditions necessary to grow enough food to avoid starvation. So good weather was a gift, and the produce that came from that was also a gift. So again, we don't need to worry about the metaphysical reality of this or how well it works as an explanation of how the physical world actually works. What's important is that this shows another way that traditional African thought embraced a worldview integrating human practices with broader nature in general without privileging humans over other natural entities. So we had 4 suggested ways of getting a non-anthropocentric view out of traditional African thought. I think at least 3 of them are worth taking seriously. So without embracing the religious and metaphysical notions embedded in African environmental thought, we could still sum up a lot of what Madavo points out with the conception of the virtue of reverence. So this is me adding on to what he says. He doesn't specifically bring up reverence, but I think we can believe that an attitude of reverence towards all things, or at least including nature as a whole, that's virtuous regardless of your theological commitments. And that seemed to be underlying a lot of the thought in this Rainmaker tradition to me. Now, reverence as a virtue, and one that can be extended to a kind of environmental virtue, a form of environmental reverence, that really deserves its own discussion. And if that's something that you're interested in following up on, there's a book from 2014 by the philosopher Paul Woodruff, arguing that we should return to this idea of reverence as an important virtue in human life. I think that's really worth looking into. So if you're interested, you should check out that book. But for now, we can see the idea of reverence as being sort of conceptually related to notions like respect and humility and compassion. And all of those are plausibly virtues as well. So again, we see a kind of combined picture of several different virtues all working together to give us the appropriate picture of how humans should relate to nature. Okay, that's what I wanted you to get out of Madavo's reading. So thank you all, and that's where we will stop for today.